Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage. It's a Saturday evening, about 5:30 in the afternoon. It seems like it's been dark for about 4 hours already. I've already had dinner, took a nap. Wasn't quite ready for bed, so I figured I'd come out to the garage and work on rear ends. I have dragged and traded this particular center section for 10 years. Dragged it around and traded it off a couple of times, and it always finds its way home. It is a new 350 ring and pinion with a new, I assume it's a track lock. I think it's Ford Motorsport. That part's fine. Everything else is original junk. The yoke is a 1350 yoke, but it's too long. So if you were to build a drive shaft and put this combination in your car, and then you break that yoke in half and you go to buy a forged yoke, this is an inch shorter, like all the rest of them. Ford has different lengths and different widths, they call them. This thing is called a long wide. So it's 1350, but it's too long and it's weak. A single rib case is good in a street rod or something you're just putting around with, but any combination of power and traction, this thing's gonna split wide open and spill your guts everywhere. So while this will never be suited for a race car, let's just take it somewhere in the middle. So I have bought these houses, and I'm going to take the guts out of this and put it in this. I have to strip the pinion bearings off it anyway, because the factory Ford pinion support has two small bearings, and this has a Daytona support, which has a larger inner bearing. And I don't know if the pinion still has a crush collar, or if it has shims, which is the way it will go back together. These cases are 325 side bearing. This is a 306 31 spline track lock. So I bought conversion bearings that'll fit on the 306 differential and fit the 325 case. So those were from Quick Performance. At some point it may be, if I didn't already have the case, it's probably cheaper to buy a 306 case than to buy special bearings. But in this case, I wanted to use the junk that I have, and as I mentioned, I have a forged Quick Performance 1350 yoke, and this is, you'll find this to be a common length with most all aftermarket yokes. So when you set this up and put it in your car and build the drive shaft, and you want to put a better center section in, it should bolt right up. It's 1350 and the correct length. All important stuff. There's a lot to know, a lot of ins and outs with the 9-inch Ford, and most of the misinformation and things you need to know are based on the fact that they tried to do everything as small and as cheaply as possible. If it wasn't for the aftermarket and NASCAR running this style rear end for decades, and drag racing of course, it would just be another rear end that the center dropped out, because in this configuration it's only slightly stronger than anything else, if it is at all. So you'll notice any factory Ford performance car had a twin rib case and probably had an N cast into it that was nodular iron. So even Ford knew that this thing was weak. And again, they in their performance cars would go from 28 spline to 31 spline axles. So got to give GM credit. They pretty much, if they built the rear end, good or bad, it all had pretty much the same spline axle for quite a spell anyway. I know, like for instance, the 8.5 differential went to a bigger spline axle somewhere around 1990, but that was after 15 years of production, probably 20 years of production. So anyway, I'm gonna gun this all apart, this one. Not even gonna put it in my stirrup, my holder. Just gonna bound it apart, and I'll put this one, I'll clean it and put it in the holder for reassembly. Disassembly notes thus far. I bolted the new housing into my bench mule, bench holder, whatever you want to call it, and then chased the old one around the bench. Definitely a colossal waste of time. I should have bolted the old one in first, and I know better, but I thought it would come apart a wee bit easier, but it's never been run. You can see everything's still packed with red grease. But they did a really good job, for instance, sealing up the yoke, so I had to get a puller out for that. I need to press off this bearing with my clamshell style bearing remover. I remember now that the little piton that goes in the end is supposed to have a clip or something that holds it in, and that is missing. I'm going to try just an O-ring. I guess worst case scenario, I'll stuff it full of paper, but I think an O-ring will hold it. It just holds it until it makes contact, so we'll deal with that in a minute. To get the bearing off the pinion, this style remover requires you to use a race, and the races are still in the old pinion support, so I have an old race, so I'll just put that on there and use the clamshell style remover. Check these out. They're a couple $100 and they're awesome. I'll be able to reuse that bearing. It doesn't even hurt anything. I've yet to hurt a bearing with it. All I've hurt is this little missing clip. And I'd forgotten about that. Well, somewhat. Every now and then I see one of these for sale. I try to figure out where I could get the one replacement part. And here I sit. And I had to go on holiday, on walkabout, to find all my parts. I knew I had bought a new set of Daytona pinion bearings. You'll see how much bigger the inner bearing is than the stock outer. In stock form, I believe the inner and outer are the same size. And now we have a much bigger inner. Nothing compared to the 35 spline ring and pinion I'm going to set up after this one for the 55 Chevy, the Race 55. That's a 35 spline pinion. It has a huge inner bearing. This is a 28 spline pinion, and it has a very adequate inner bearing. I mean, in NASCAR, for instance, they run small pinion, 28 spline. So just a reference, horsepower to traction, whatever. And I had to search around to find a shim kit. I knew I had them somewhere, you know. I'm really good at stocking up parts. And I got quite a war chest full of 9-inch parts, but there's always one thing it's going to trip you up. But in this case, I had that and the set of bearings. I probably bought them a year ago. I actually traded this differential away and back again while I had this stuff in stock. And then out of all my kits, I got a new seal and a new pinion support seal, a new pinion nut that I put on last after I set the drag. I'll go over that when we get there. You know, pinion bearing drag, because we're not just crushing a collar. Now we're going to do it with shims. My method is typically this is a 2-piece rig that takes up the space of the crush collar, and I take like half the shims out, tighten it all up. I have a well-worn nut that I use so I can buzz it off and on a few times, and you just get the right amount of drag. At this point I go by feel. You'll know when it's right and you'll know when it's not, if you've done a few of them, or even one. And then I'll assemble it for real with a new nut and sealer on the splines of the pinion, just like whoever did this did. Somebody did a really good job. I believe it was probably a professional assembly, who knows. So that's where we stand so far. One note on the new case, the third bearing, if you will, on the 9-inch Ford, that has that silly clip. Well, right here, if you can see it. The new aluminum housing has a C-clip or E-clip, whatever you want to call it, and snap ring. How's that? Much superior than the Ford toothed. I'll show you one here in a second. I just had it in my hand a minute ago. I've showed it to you before. You drive the bearing into the housing on a Ford housing, and then you put that multi-teeth thing, you just kind of pop it in there and hope it stays, and most of the time they stay, but certainly not as secure as a snap ring in a groove. So now you're up to speed. I got more work to do. I think I'm going to go ahead and take a little nap. It's a nap. Yeah, we'll take a nap. Going to get a snack, and we'll see if I come back out or not. If not, I'll do it tomorrow. So here we go. It's the next day. I went outside, started walking up to the house. First I encountered my local neighborhood owl. Scared the pants off me. And then I went up around the corner, and in the front yard there was 2 deer drinking out of a puddle. And when they scurried off, once again, the old heart rate skipped up because you never, prepared for it. I'm just walking up the driveway, enjoying the stars and the beautiful night. And my neighbor's house, I have a new neighbor, and they decorated the house for Christmas. That's never happened. So down through the woods, I can see Christmas lights. That made me happy. This morning, I have set up the clamshell bearing remover on the pinion. It's a pretty simple rig. It looks complicated, but it's not. You got different size shells that actually go over and underneath the bearing. And this ring just holds these two together. And then I have the pinion knot on the pinion and a little spacer that came with the rig so you can have enough threads to do some pulling. And I'm going to get the gun and my safety glasses and see if it comes off. All right. How much battery we got here? Well, we got four stars. That ought to be it. Let's see what happens. Sorry about the noise, but it's that easy. I got the pinion knot on there, so back that off, back this off, take that off, take that off. I forgot to mention you adjust these silver things to grab on the other side of the shell. That was the spacer I used. Get that out of your way. Those back in there. Take my nut off, so I protected my threads. And one bearing, perfectly unharmed, ready to do battle another day in another rear end. First thing this morning, when I came out, I did go and find an O-ring. I was able to tap it in there and it's working. And I have a never-ending supply of tiny O-rings, so that looks like it'll work to hold my little piton on the end of my threaded piece. So now I'll set up and do the carrier bearings too. They give you this bigger spacer with different ends. So whatever works the best, probably that one. And that just takes up the space inside here. Same deal, put the shells over it and pull them off. Set up on the carrier, in this case the black clamshells fit a little better. I've already done one side and it was successful. Let's see what happens. Sorry about the noise and the vibrations. Just like that. I love this thing. Excuse me. The only thing that was stressing me out is my little piton was falling off, and it was a pain to get it set up, but a 3-cent O-ring, we're back in business. I'm going to sound like a tool salesman, and trust me, I'm not. This is how the clamshell bearing puller stores, and this is a 36 millimeter front wheel drive axle socket that I don't use very often, and it fits the nut on this puller perfectly, 1/2-inch drive, so I don't need an adapter to run it with my cordless impact. And this whole thing sits together, currently on top of a bench, but because it's kind of big, but it balances pretty good. It's heavy, and that's the way it lives. In one of these little compartments, I have the piece of the broken wire that used to hold my little piton on, but like I mentioned, I guess the O-ring is going to work. So next I need to press on the bearings. The inner pinion bearing, the beauty of a 9-inch Ford, there are no shims under the bearings. You can just go ahead and push them on. So I just have a piece of roll cage tubing that happens to fit the inner race of a 9-inch Ford perfectly, because you want to push on the center of the bearing. You want to push on this part. You don't want to hurt the rollers at all. They should always be free. And for the 3.25 housing bearing, I have a tool all cut up out of a piece of black iron pipe that fits the center, but in this case I have this inner race out of a pinion bearing, probably. Happens to fit the inner part of the carrier bearing just fine, and I'll push on that in the press and push that one on. We'll be ready to start doing some assembly. Well, I guess this technically is assembly, but you know what I mean. Here's my press setup. It's super important when you're using the press to have as much stuff under your feet as possible. On a 9-inch Ford, the bearing goes beyond the differential, so there's no stress. I'm pushing right on the actual carrier, not on the bearing, which you wouldn't want to do that. If the bearing stuck out beyond here, I would put a spacer underneath. So again, super important to make sure it's free and you're pushing on the middle. This is an air-powered press, but they go on so easy. I'm just jacking them on there. Before I press on the inner pinion bearing on my 28 spline pinion, I have all the parts here for the Race 55 Chevy as well, which is going to be a 35 spline pinion. And let's do a size comparison. You can see the pinion nut, obvious difference. The outer bearings, the inner bearing, and then the pinion support itself. I went with a 10 bolt on the 55 because I thought it'd be handy to have the extra bolt holes, because I'm going to put a U-joint enclosure on the rear end as well. And someday I might want data pickup. I might want extra bolts back there. I'm not really afraid of the pinion support jumping out of the housing, but hey, extra bolts are extra bolts. So the Daytona support is a big increase over stock, but you can see when you go to the big pinion how everything gets bigger. But through the magic of machining and engineering, they all fit in the same case. This is not the case I'm going to use in the Race 55. I just bought a Yukon, which has a matching 10 bolts, and it's a through bolt, probably stronger. There's better out there, but for what I'm going to start with, that'll be just fine. I got a little sidetracked. I've never had a good installer for the 35 spline inner race. The outer race, I found another race that fit perfect, but the inner, I can't quite get it down all the way in, so I'm making a pusher. I figured I might as well set up the big pinion bearing setup while I got all the pressing devices out. Remember my limping deer? That's her on the right. Must be one of the babies on the left. Still limping. Here's a comparison between the 35 spline pinion with the inner bearing pushed on and the 28 spline with the Daytona bearing pushed on. So this is your stock crush collar. Not going to run it. This, for the 28 spline pinion, takes its place. Inside it is full of shims. So my super high-tech method is I take the shim pack, cut it in half, put half back in, and assemble it and see what happens. Put the yoke on. I have a worn out nut, but if you don't have a nut, just space the new nut up so the locking portion doesn't engage the end of the pinion. Just come up with some washers or something. And I have a whole kit dedicated to that, as well as the die if I had to fix the threads. So I do a lot of 28 spline stuff. So today I'm taking the time to gear up to do the 35 spline stuff too. And I'm going to bolt it together and just spin it till I like the feel. One shim either direction will either be too tight, too loose, or just right. Kind of like the baby bears. You need bearing preload. These are brand new bearings. When they become familiar with each other, when they break in, they're going to get looser. So if you started with it spinning easy, it's going to get loose. So you need to start with a little bit of drag, and when they break in, then it should be honeymoon. It's really blustery outside right now, but I'm safe here in the shop, enjoying my Sunday afternoon, going at everything with a slow pace, which always makes things more enjoyable. I put the pinion together the first time, the 28 spline pinion. I'm lucky, this one, the yoke, comes off and on the splines without any fanfare, and the outer bearing slides up and down the pinion stem. Well, sometimes I have to get the puller out to take it apart every time. This time I could just take the nut off and pull it apart. Well, tap it apart with my favorite dead blow hammer. Just tap on the end, fall it apart. I was too loose the first time, slightly too tight the second time, and on the third attempt I added the 2/1000 shim, and now it won't spin free, but it's got just the right amount of drag. And yes, I could measure it, but I'm not going to, because I'm within 2/1000 of being too tight. So, and adding more was going to make it worse. So this is the sweet spot. I have a tool. When I take the yoke back off, I can drive the seal in around the existing pinion, because some of these, I'm telling you, they come apart hard. This one I can pop right apart. Remember to put the inner bearing in the pinion support. I could pound the seal in on the bench and then reassemble it that way. It doesn't really matter. So like I say, I made a tool to go down over and put the seal in. So that will be the next step for this one. And yes, I'm always surprised when you put the new seal in, you get everything lubed up, you put sealer on the splines and a little bit under the nut, a little Loctite on the nut, and you tighten it up and it still spins correctly. I don't know why it's surprising me, because mechanically it can't change, but I guess my fear of wrecking a seal. All right, I'm afraid this video is running long, but at this point I'm going to keep going. I put in the pinion seal with my whacker, put sealer on the splines, sealer under the nut, Loctite on the nut. It's tight, it's perfect, it's ready to go in. I'm going to put it in without the O-ring first, because I need to check the pinion depth. I have no reason to believe it's not going to take the same shim it had in the other housing. It's a good starting point, if nothing else. It's a 13/1000 it says on it. Typically I'd start, if I was guessing from scratch, I'd start around 20/1000, but this is what it had, and I'm going to do so. I need to install this in the case. This is the Ford thing I was telling you about. Not required, because this has a nice beefy snap ring. I have learned doing 9-inch Fords that I can go ahead and put the carrier in, make sure it clears everything, and the pinion can go in and out as often as I like. You don't have to put this in first and this in second, like a lot of rear ends. This can be in place, and you can pull this in and out at will. So when I finally arrive at the proper pattern and backlash, I can pop this right out, put the O-ring on, bolt it in for real. So I'm going to go ahead and again make sure I have clearance, which I don't expect any clearance problems, but you never know. And I'll check back with it in a minute. All thrown together on the stirrup here. You have to be really careful putting these in to make sure they spin easy when the bolts are tight. Then I back these off just a little bit so I can slide the bearing race. And I bring it up to the proper backlash and tighten those by hand. Make sure these are, tight against each other. No preload yet, but. And then go ahead and put marking compound on the gear. And we're way out to lunch. I have a spiky drive way up there, and my coast is way over there. And I say the spiky because in some instances I consider that acceptable, but the end is round. Mine is spiky like this, so pinion is too close. So I'm going to go ahead all the way out to the 20/1000 like I would have started with anyway. See what happens. All I need to do is flip it over, take out 3 bolts with the gun, pop the pinion out, add shims, put it back together, try again. Piece of cake. Well, adding shims, moving the pinion further away, kept making it worse. So just for kicks, I went back in. I actually started with 0 shims. And I started with a 13, now I'm at 7/1000, and that's about as good as it's going to get. I've tried everything I had in between, and that's very similar to how it was. So it's amazing what a few thousandths will do. Now I just have to I put one flat, if you will, of preload on both sides, because I'm tight right now, so anything I add with the adjuster at this point is going to be bearing preload. And some people put both, 2 on one side. I'm going to go 1 hole on each side and call it good. Pop my pinion out, put the O-ring on it, and we're done. So that finishes up the 28 spline 350 geared center section. And I got a good start on my 457 big pinion gear set for the Race 55 Chevy. I chose that gear ratio because I bought the ring and pinion used a few years ago, and I've been hanging on to it for something. And if I indeed run a 36-inch tire, or even a 34.5, 457 is not as steep as you think. So I have to do the math on it, but right now I'm setting it up because it's what I got, and I bought all the corresponding pieces to do it. And future Sean can worry about whether it's the ideal ratio or not. So this video already ran long. Next, I might as well finish up this one. Probably start on that in the morning. What you couldn't see during this whole thing is, one, I walked back up to the house this morning, made some cinnamon streusel muffins that were delicious, and then I put a Boston butt pork roast in my Dutch oven at 250 degrees for 4 hours, and that is almost ready. And all I've eaten today is muffins, so I'm gonna chow down on that thing. So hope you're having a great Sunday. Take her easy. Thanksgiving week coming up and Black Friday. Look for deals.